What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Common Coder. My name is Josh, and in this video we're going to be breaking down the CSS Box Model, one of the most fundamental concepts of web design when it comes to working with CSS. We'll cover what it is, why it matters, the different parts that make up the box model, and how you can tweak its behavior to create more predictable layouts. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, now before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites in order to follow along with this video. The first is that you'll want to have an understanding of HTML fundamentals, so things like elements and attributes, and it would also be helpful to know the difference between block and inline elements. Next, you'll want to have a basic understanding of CSS, specifically things like selectors and how to work with and set various CSS properties. Now, it'll also be helpful if you understand how to use your browser's development tools, as we're going to be using them quite a bit throughout this video. Now, I'm going to be using Google Chrome, but you should be able to follow along using something like Firefox or Microsoft Edge, which also have pretty good developer tools. Finally, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code exclusively throughout this demo, but feel free to use the editor of your choice as long as you have a way to quickly run HTML files. Now, if you need any help with anything listed here, I do have videos on several of these topics, which I'll go ahead and link down in the description below. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing that we need to understand is that in HTML and CSS, everything is a box, and I do literally mean everything. Now, there are a few exceptions to this, such as what is inside a canvas element, for example, but even with the canvas element, it starts with a box and conforms to the CSS box model. And so let's go ahead and take a look and see what I mean by this. All right, so if we go to a well-known website like walmart.com, for example, you can see that in this layout, there are a lot of box type elements. We have a large rectangle for our top level navigation, then we have another rectangle for our sub navigation, and then all of these little tiles essentially in the middle here are all types of boxes. If we scroll down, we have the placeholders that look like boxes. So we can see the structure of this layout is very much centered around boxes. Now we can get a better visual representation of this if I go ahead and open up the developer tools, and I'm gonna go ahead and expand this a little bit and then make sure I'm on the elements tab. And then I'm gonna expand this bottom section here so we can take a look at the styles. And what I'm gonna do is go ahead and add a style that selects every element that's on this page. So I'm gonna do that using the asterisk or the star. And then what I'm gonna do is go ahead and put a red border around everything. So I'll say border 3 pixels solid red. All right, and you can see that that is very, very overwhelming, but you can see here that even things like this right arrow that appears to be a circle is actually inside of a box. And you can see even here up at the top, we do have like these rounded borders here, but that's coming from the border radius. The outer section of this is actually a box. And so you can see this whole entire page, even elements that look like they are not boxes are in fact boxes. Let's go ahead and see one more example of something that might not be quite as obvious. So if we go to Spotify.design, and you can see that this is a little bit more visually appealing website. We do have some box elements on here, but we do have some things that don't quite look like they're part of boxes. And so we can do the same thing here. I can go ahead and open up the developer tools, go down to my style section. I'm gonna go ahead and add a style to this page, target every element using the star, and then we'll give it a border of 3 pixels solid red. All right, and you can see again, here is the box structure. Even these smaller elements here are inside boxes, inside of other boxes, inside of other boxes. We can see that even some of the elements, like the squiggly arrow here, is inside a box itself. The footer down here at the bottom is a series of boxes, so on and so forth. And so that is the fundamental thing to understand about HTML and CSS, is that everything is inside of a box. Now, if you remember from the prerequisites, I mentioned it would be a good idea to have an understanding of the difference between HTML block and inline elements. So if you're not familiar with that, we'll go ahead and cover it quickly here. But there are essentially 3 main types of boxes, and these are derived from the CSS display property, which we're going to see here in just a minute. So these boxes can either be block, inline, or inline block. And as we can see from the screen here, depending on the type of box that you're using is going to impact how you can position and style and work with that element. So first we have block level elements over here on the left. A block element takes up the full width of its container, and each block element starts on a new line. So you can see over here on the left-hand side, if these elements were children of the main body tag on the HTML page, each one of these elements would take up the full width of the screen. And then every one that you add would start on its own line. So we can see we have 3 here. Each one starts on its own line, and it stretches to fill the width of the parent container. Now, inline elements, on the other hand, only take as much space as needed by the content that's inside. And so it flows in line with the content. And so some examples of this would be some bold or highlighted text in a paragraph, or maybe an image or a hyperlink. And so you can see here, this inline element is inside of this block level element, and it's only taking up as much space as the text inside. And so we can see various examples of this here, where the inline element is only taking up as much space as needed. Now, the last one here is sort of a hybrid, which is called inline block. And this is very similar to inline in that it only takes up as much space as needed by the content that's inside of it, but it gives you a little bit more control over the element like you have with a block element. So you can set things like width and height and top and bottom margin and padding, which is something that you can't do with a regular inline element. And so if you're interested in learning more about the differences between these elements, I did a whole video on this topic, which you can check out by clicking the card in the upper right-hand corner or clicking the link down in the description below. All right, so now that we've seen the different types of boxes, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is the CSS box model? Well, the box model defines how different parts of the box work together. And we've already sort of touched on a few of these without really realizing it, but there are 4 main parts to every box. And those parts are content, padding, border, and margin. And we're going to break down each one of these in a bit more detail as we move through the rest of the video. Now, going back to the different box types, it's important to note that inline elements don't use every part of the box model. So like we mentioned before, the top and bottom padding and margin are ignored on inline elements, as well as the width and height CSS properties that are typically used to size elements. And we'll see why that's important here in just a minute, but just remember that if you do need control over these properties, you want to set your element's CSS display property from inline to inline block. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the different parts of the CSS box model. So first we have the content, and the content is what goes inside the box. Now this could be text, it could be an image, or it could even be other boxes, aka elements. Now, if we think in terms of a physical box, it's the thing or things that we are going to put inside of that box. In addition, we can set the width and height of this content area depending on the type of element or box that we are using. Block and inline block elements allow you to adjust the width and height, while inline elements do not. And this would be achieved using the element's CSS width and height properties. However, it's worth mentioning that this behavior changes depending on which box model that we're using. And we'll go ahead and talk about that plot twist here in just a minute. Next, we have the padding. Now, the padding separates what is inside of the box from its border, essentially the edge of the box, which may or may not be visible. This gives us space between the edge of the box and the content that is inside of it. We can also adjust the padding independently on all sides of the box, depending on the needs of our layout. Now, again, if we think in terms of a physical box, you could think of the padding as the packing peanuts or the newspaper or the bubble wrap that is used to secure or pad something that is inside of the box. Then we have the border. The border encloses the content and the padding, and just like we mentioned before, it may or may not be visible. So if we go back to the Walmart and Spotify example that we saw a little earlier, we essentially use the browser's dev tools to forcibly put a border around every element that exists on the web page. And if you remember, most of those weren't visible before we added those borders. Now we can also set the width of the border on each side of the box, and we can also change its style. So we don't have to necessarily have a solid border like we saw before. We can also have a dashed border, a dotted border, so on and so forth. Now, going back to our physical box example, we can think of the border as the actual box that's holding everything inside of it. Now, it could be a heavy duty box, in which case it would have a thicker border, or it could be something like a gift box, which would have a much thinner border. Finally, we have the margin, and the margin is the space that separates the current box from other boxes. So imagine if you had multiple physical boxes and you wanted to arrange them in a way so that each box was separated by a gap of 1 inch. This is what margin would essentially allow you to do, but in the world of HTML and CSS. Now, it's important to note that the box's area, its width and its height, stops at the border and doesn't extend into the margin. So this means that the margin does not affect the size of the actual box, but it will affect how much space that element takes up on the screen. So again, going back to our example using physical boxes, this would actually make a lot of sense. The space between the physical boxes doesn't have an overall effect on the size of each box, even though they would technically be taking up more space in the area that they're in. Now, like I mentioned before, we can change the size of each part of the box individually. So in the case of this graphic, we have a content area that is 300 pixels wide and 150 pixels tall. Next, we have a padding area of 20 pixels around all sides of the content, which we can see here. Then we have a border of 5 pixels around the entire box. So we can see that here in the purple. And then finally, we have a margin of 20 pixels around everything. And that would space the inner part, basically from the border inwards, away from any other element. Now in the standard box model, which is the default for every HTML element, assigning the width and the height to the element affects the size of the content area of the box, and which is why this standard box model is called content box, which we can see right here. Now this can cause some confusion for those that are new to HTML and CSS, because you would think that setting something like the width to 300 pixels would mean the entire box is 300 pixels wide. However, the actual width of the box is 300, which is the width of the box, plus 20, which is the padding, but we have padding on each side, so it'd be 20 plus 20. And then same thing with the border, we have a 5 pixel border on each side, so plus 5 equals 350 pixels. So the actual space on the screen that this element would take up would be 350 pixels, even though you explicitly set the element's width to 300 pixels. And we can see the same is true for the height. So we have a height being set of 150 pixels, but the actual height would be 150 plus 20, which is the padding on the bottom, plus 20, which is the padding on the top, plus 5 pixels on the bottom for the border, plus another 5 on the top for the border, equals a total height of 200 pixels. So the actual space that this element would take up on the screen would be 350 pixels by 200 pixels. And so that would be the size of the element. And then again, it would actually take up another 20 pixels on all the sides for the margin, but that's not the actual size of the element itself. That's just the space between this element and other elements. So like I mentioned before, this can make it a little bit difficult and confusing to get the style and layout that you want, especially if you're not familiar with how the box model works. And so fortunately, we can modify this behavior by using an alternative box model called border box. And so by default, every element has its box sizing property set to content box, meaning that the element's width and height only include the content while the padding and the borders are added on top of that. However, if we change the box sizing property to border box, the width and height will now include the padding and the borders, which makes sizing our elements much more predictable. So if we take a look at the alternate box model here, we can see that when we change the element to use this box model, the width and the height given to the element apply to the entire element, including the padding and the border. However, this results in the content area being dynamically sized based on the width and height that are given to the element. So again, if we say the element size is going to be 300 pixels by 150 pixels, you can see that that would result in our content area being 250 pixels by 100 pixels. And so the content area would shrink down to that size due to the element's padding and border. Now, like in the content box example, margin doesn't affect the actual physical size of the element, but it does have an impact on how much space it takes up on the screen. And so again, we have our actual width here, which is going to be 250 pixels, so the dynamically sized content area, plus the 20 pixels on each side for the padding, plus the 5 pixels on each side for the border, bringing our total element width to 300 pixels. And then similarly for the height, we have a dynamically sized height of 100 because we have a padding of 20 pixels on the top and the bottom, and then also a border of 5 pixels on the top and bottom as well, bringing our total height to 150 pixels. So you can see how this box model would make it much more predictable when it comes to sizing your HTML elements, and it makes it easier to achieve more complex layouts with HTML and CSS. Now, that's not to say that you want to always have things set to border box. There are some legitimate use cases for using content box, so it really just depends on the needs of your layout, and you can change this property individually on each element as needed. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump over to VS Code so we can see what this looks like in real life. Now, if you want to follow along with the code that I'm using, you can get it at the GitHub URL shown on the screen or by clicking the link down in the description below. All right, so on my screen here, you can see that I have the project open here in VS Code, and there is a start folder and an end folder. So if you want to follow along using the code that I'm using, we're going to go ahead and work through this start folder here. And then if you want to see what the code looks like at the end, it'll be inside of the end folder. But basically, I have this HTML page open over here in my browser using the live server extension for Visual Studio Code. And if you're not familiar with how to use different extensions in Visual Studio Code, I'll go ahead and link a video up in the right-hand corner of the screen or down in the description below to go ahead and help you get started. Now, down here in the bottom, I basically have two boxes, and they're both currently set to use the content box. So we're using the default right here, and essentially it's this blue area. Now, I have some other styles around the outside to give it a little bit nicer visual presentation, but what what we're going to do is add some styles to these blue boxes and then see what happens when we change this one over here on the right from using content box to border box. So to do that, what I'm going to do is go ahead and close my HTML page and then close my little live server warning. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up the styles and then just collapse my Explorer panel so I have a little bit more room to work with here. Now I have these comments where I put start adjust styles here. And so we're going to go ahead and work within this area. So what we're going to do is go ahead and add some of the different parts of the box model to this element. And you can see that right now we don't have a border, we don't have any margin, we don't have any padding, we essentially don't have any of the things that we've just been learning about. So let's go ahead and add some things here so that way we can give the boxes some styling. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and set the width and the height. So we're going to use that same example, width and height. So we'll say width, and then we'll go ahead and set it to 300 pixels for the width. We don't see any difference here because the actual size of my outer box is also 300 pixels. But we can see when we add the height, we should see some changes. So we can say height, 150 pixels. There we go. Let's go ahead and scroll down a little bit so we can see it. All right. And then next thing we're going to do is go ahead and add some padding. So we'll say padding. We'll go ahead and add our 20 pixels of padding. And you can see what that's doing is it's actually spilling outside of the bounds of the containing box because the containing box is set explicitly to 300 pixels wide. However, we also have a 300 pixel box inside of it, plus the 20 pixels of padding on each side. And since it's starting here and going that way, it's actually overflowing by 40 pixels. So the 20 pixels of padding on the left and the 20 pixels of padding on the right. So, and I did that intentionally so that you can see how these properties affect the overall width and height of the box. All right, so now what we're going to do is go ahead and add our border. So we'll just say border, and so we'll go ahead and give it a 5 pixel border, solid red. All right, and we can see again, it's spilling out by not only the padding pixel amount, but now also from the border pixel amount. And then finally, let's go ahead and give it some margin. Now remember, margin doesn't affect the actual size of the box, but it does have an impact on how it renders onto the screen. So if I say margin, and we'll go ahead and set that to 20 pixels. All right, and now you can see that it's pushing the content away from the edge of the containing box and then moving it even farther outside of the bounds. And remember, there's some margin here as well. So it's going to be pushing the content over here on the right-hand side. And what we can do to visualize this, we can go ahead and right-click any element here and click Inspect. And we're going to go ahead and hover over our box, and we can actually see, go ahead and make this just a little bit bigger so we can see it, right? So we can actually see the padding being applied, we can see the border being applied, and the margin. So the lightish orange color on the outside is the margin. So if we scroll down into the Dev Tools here in the Styles tab, we can actually see that here. So we have our content area, which is 300 pixels by 150 pixels. Then we have our 20 pixels of padding all the way around. Then we have our border of 5 pixels. Now it looks like I might have a slight bug in my code somewhere, but that's okay. So 5 pixels of border around the edges. And then finally, we have our 20 pixels of margin all the way around, which you can see is represented by that light orange. Now, as of right now, the second box, which we're going to set to border box, is exactly the same. Go ahead and expand this a little bit and take a look at that. You can see it has exactly the same thing. 300 by 150, 20 pixels of padding, 5 pixels of border, and then 20 pixels of margin. All right, so now let's go ahead and change our second box's box sizing property from content box to border box. If we take a look at the HTML, if we scroll down to where our boxes are at, what we're going to go ahead and do is create another class and then add it to our second box here. And that class is going to change the box sizing property to border box. So what I'll go ahead and do here is go ahead and add another class. So we'll call this border-box. And then all this is going to do is set the box sizing property to border box. All right, so we don't have any changes yet because I haven't applied the class. So let's go back to the HTML file, and then in our second box here, we'll go ahead and add the additional class. We'll say border box. Go ahead and save that change. And you can see that this now shrank down quite a bit because the size that we're giving it, the 300 pixels by 150 pixels, is the actual size of the element up to the edge of the border. So if I right click on this and click Inspect, and if we scroll down here, we can see now the inner content area has been resized to 250 pixels by 100 pixels. Then we have our padding, which is 20. And then we have our border, which is 5, and then finally our margin. Now the margin doesn't actually affect the size of the element like we mentioned before, but it is pushing it away from the edge of the box, which we can see is still making it overflow outside of its container. So for this element specifically, if we were to set the margins, I'm just going to do this here in the dev tools and set the margin to 0. You can see that it fits nicely inside of the box because I have changed the box sizing property to border box, and now setting the element to 300 pixels makes it fit nicely inside of its parent, which is also 300 pixels. So let me go ahead and undo that. So remember what's happening here is the content area is being dynamically resized to 250 by 100 because it's taking into account the padding, which is 40 pixels total, so 20 on each side, plus the border, which is 5 on each side, bringing us to a total of 300 by 150, which is the width and height that I'm giving to that element. So if we go back to our styles, remember inside of this class here, we're setting the width and height to 300 by 150. So both of these have their width properties set to the same, but because this one is border box, we are now sizing the element up into the border rather than just the content area. And so you can see how this could be helpful depending on the needs of your layout. If you're trying to position elements inside of other elements, using something like border box gives you much more predictable results because the content area gets dynamically resized and you can fit elements into their containers a lot easier than you can using the content box model. All right, and that is pretty much going to wrap up this video on the CSS box model. As always, thank you so much for coding along with me today. Really appreciate you being here, especially if you made it this far into the video. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing for more web development content. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, be sure to leave those down in the comments below. And until next time, be sure to stay curious, never stop learning, and I will see you all in the next video.